Hello, students in Johnson University's Foundations of Theology class. This is your professor again, Dr. David Russell Mosley. I realized last time I made you a video, I didn't actually give my name. And also, while I know I sent out an email when the class first started with some stuff about myself, I realized that many of you weren't members of the class yet in that first day or two, and so perhaps you missed out on that. So I thought I'd make a short video just introducing myself to you. So, as I said, I'm Dr. David Russell Mosley. I have a PhD in theology from the University of Nottingham in England, where my wife and I lived for 3 years. I have a master's in church history and historical theology from Lincoln Christian University, and I have a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Exposition from Lincoln Christian University, although at the time it was Lincoln Christian College. I currently live out in New England with my wife and my 2 sons, whom you can, if I move this way, it's a picture of them a few weeks after they were born. They're almost 2 now. Some things just to know about me in general. When it comes to being a theologian, I have wide-ranging interests. My doctoral dissertation was on a subject called deification, and if you take my Trinity class with Johnson, we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of that class. But it's also sometimes called theosis. It's something we primarily associate with Eastern Orthodoxy, but is something that's been believed by Christians for a long time. Won't get into that. I'm not doing a video about deification. Feel free to email me about it, though, if you so desire. I'm also very interested in, I have degrees in church history, historical theology, so I'm really interested in reading what ancient and medieval Christians have to say on various subjects. I think that's profoundly important for us today, because something that we always have to remember when we're doing theology as Christians is that we share a lot of history with the other Christian denominations. And I don't just mean, so for those of you who are part of the Restoration movement, you may know or you may not, that the Restoration movement really kind of came out of both Irish and American Presbyterianism, American Methodism, and the American Baptists, as well as some other independent groups, but most of them came out of the Methodists or the Baptists themselves. But we don't just share history with the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Baptists. We also share history with the Roman Catholics, with the Eastern Orthodox, and with all the other Protestant denominations as well. And the reason for that is, so in the Restoration movement, we're pretty famous for going back to, say, Acts chapter 2. We're returning to the first century church. Well, the fact of the matter is that the first century church became the second century church, and the second century church became the third century church, and so on. One of the really first formal divides doesn't happen until the 8th century, and that is over some language issues, and a lot of that's being actually overcome today. And it had to do with the nature of Jesus' natures and his wills. Something that we'll talk about a little bit this week when we talk about Jesus, but you'd need a more in-depth course on the incarnation for that. But anyway, so that's the first real formal split between Christians, and it wasn't a big one. The first big one doesn't come until the 11th century, when the issues that were already developing between what we now call the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church were developing. From there, the next major split doesn't happen until the 16th century. That is, until the 1500s with Martin Luther, who himself wasn't trying to split up the church. So I bring all that up to say, that means for those of us who are Western Christians, those of us particularly who are Western Protestants, we can trace pretty much 1,500 years of history, of our own history, that is the same history as that of the Roman Catholics, and 1,100 years of the same history with the Eastern Orthodox. So it's very important that we remember that. If you're interested in church history and why that kind of stuff matters, just don't mind me. I'm going to turn around for a moment, see if I can't find the book that I'm looking for. It may not be readily available to me. Right, so I can't find it. Right, aha, never mind. I found it. See, I kind of like making these videos better than lectures because I can just say whatever I want. So this book, Why Church History Matters, is a really very excellent book on why people from non-denominational Christian backgrounds, people from the Restoration movement in particular, ought to engage in church history. And this was written by my major professor for my master's at Lincoln, Dr. Robert Ray, who still teaches church history there. And you could probably never meet a man who knows more about or is more dedicated to the ideals of the Restoration movement. Okay, so the way I do theology tends to be by looking at what the people we call the church fathers or the church doctors have taught. Because I think that, of course, it's always possible for them to be wrong. As so many of you have pointed out in your papers, especially the papers about creeds, they're fallible human men. They are fallen, just like I am, just like you are. But the fact of the matter is that their works have stood the test of time. And so if we're going to disagree with them, if we're going to say that they're wrong, the burden of proof is on us, because their ideas have lasted, and our ideas are new. It's not to say that a new idea is always wrong. It just means that we need to be really careful about how we make our arguments. If an idea has lasted for a long time. That's all. More generally, things that I'm interested in. Before I go into that, just briefly, my thesis, my dissertation is being turned into a book, so you can buy that if you want when it comes out. Who knows when that'll be. My thesis also dealt a lot with literature, so I'm a very big fan of literature, particularly the works of, say, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. I like J.K. Rowling. I like the Harry Potter series. But I love to read. I love to read fantasy and fairy tales. I love to read poetry. I love to read classical fiction. So, Dickens, Jane Austen, things of that nature. What else about me? I do love poetry. I write some poetry and I write some fiction. I actually have another book coming out, probably late this year. A little fantasy novel that I wrote during the second year of my PhD. I'm married, have a wife, 2 kids, twins, boys, as you can see behind me. Their names are Theodore Nicholas George Mosley and Edwin Arthur Russell Mosley. Otherwise, I love to read, I love to write. I'm a huge fan of fountain pens, and so I handwrite most of my notes. I handwrite letters to friends. I write a blog, and I'm also featured on a few other websites occasionally. You can check out my blog. It's elflandletter.com. Though I do need to make very explicit that the views that I express on my blog are not necessarily the views of Johnson University. So if you see me write anything there that contradicts something that maybe you've been taught by another professor, my thoughts don't represent what Johnson thinks, necessarily. I think a lot of the time they probably do, because, I'm an Orthodox Christian, but, just safeguarding there. Okay, that's enough about me. That's enough about me. I will... I'm sorry that I don't get to meet all of you and that I can't get these kind of interactions back. But I just thought I'd make this video, introduce myself. Okay, so thanks everybody for listening to me waffle on about myself for almost 10 minutes. God bless.